Good afternoon to the panelists. Good afternoon to every other individual who Indigenous conscious, who part of an Indigenous community, who is on this platform this afternoon. Quickly, I just want to say that a lot of my work as it regards to Indigenous rights has been centered on focusing on the rights of Indigenous people regionally, right? And so my understanding of Indigenous people's rights, and I will make these points quickly, is that Indigenous people's rights is not a view on the United Nations strip, although it's part of it, or the ILO Convention 169. These are the two international instruments that contain the modern rights of Indigenous peoples. But one of the great limitations of these instruments is that it does not necessarily address the systematic injustice that Indigenous peoples experience all over the world. And so Indigenous peoples' rights specifically or limitedly, in a very limited way, only attached to current ties to land, not prior invasion rights to land, but current ties to land. And so my concern, growing up in the Kalinago Territory, my concern has always been, how do we address our marginalization? How do we address the systematic oppression that we experience? Just to quote from the 2009 Dominica Country Poverty Assessment Report of 2009, it says Indigenous persons were more likely than any other group in the national population to be poor. 49.8% of persons in the Indigenous community can be considered poor. And therefore, yes, I think as my friend mentioned, Ms. Andrews, I think that was you who said that Indigenous societies are matrifocal societies. And I think there's a lot that is being contributed to our community by our women. But so too, in that percentage as described in the poverty assessment reports, it is oftentimes, while we are we live on the periphery, we exist on the periphery, Indigenous women are on the periphery of that periphery. And so it is something that has, while we celebrate the contribution of our women, the living experience, I think, is worse than the living experience of Indigenous men. So I would like to go back to that prior point of legal rights, speaking as an attorney, so that in all of law, where there is a tort, where there is a damage, you have to take the person that was damaged to their pre-tort position, right, to the pre-damage position. And so when we speak specifically about Indigenous people's rights, one of the aspects of our rights is essentially the claims to land, right? There are reports, there are studies that has been conducted in the Kalinago Territory, which indicates that the Kalinago Forest is one of the most exhausted areas in Dominica, which points to our survival on the forest and agriculture. There is a lot of shifting cultivation practices in the Kalinago Territory, so that another issue which is closely related to land is the fact that there is fishing from the coves in the Kalinago Territory has been outlawed, and the fishermen from the Kalinago Territory have to practice fishing from the Marigot Bay, which is outside of the Kalinago Territory. So all of these things, one of the reasons that fishing has to be practiced outside of the Kalinago Territory is because the sea is too treacherous, right? So in our retreat from for example, the West Coast, we have fishing-friendly areas, the Caribbean Sea, white sand beaches, and that kind of thing. In our retreat, we ended up in an area out of fear for our own survival. And so in taking us back to our pre-thought position, our pre-damage position, if we are to make claims for more, for possession of real assets within our domestic space, then there has been no legislation, right? There has been no legislation since our independence period, or prior to our independence period, which protect the arbitrary deprivation of indigenous people's lands. Even if in Section 6 of our Constitution says that lands cannot be arbitrarily deprived without compensation, indigenous people, one of the things that make us a deprived group of people is that our land has been arbitrarily deprived without compensation. And so so this is the issue now. This is what has caused us to be in my opinion, this is what has caused, because we've seen other people experiencing the power and the economic power that land can produce, but we don't experience that. We don't experience the type of life that these people experience, because we have been deprived of our rightful resources. So can we, in a sort of, one of my interests is, can we necessarily make a claim for more land, for a reasonable, not necessarily an expansion, but for possibly further demarcations of land within Dominica? And that is a question that hopefully that can be put forward before the national courts in Dominica. And I want to say that regionally, I think even in places like Barbados, in places like Grenada, there is hardly, for example, I went to the Harrison Cave recently. I visited the Harrison Cave, and Harrison Cave is named after some colonial named Harrison, right? And there is no, the story is not that these lands or these caves were discovered they were pre-settlement or pre-invasion, that kind of thing. All of the credit is given to Afro-Caribbean people. All of the credit is given to other people except indigenous peoples. So despite the absence of presence, and Barbados, Grenada, Jamaica, Haiti, all of these countries come under a certain demographic continental sphere that belong to Amerindian people, right? It is not Africa. It is not Europe. Europe never had that continent disturbed. Africa, despite the marginalizations of African globally, the continent of Africa is still in the hands of African people. African people can still exercise power, consent, and control of African land, right? In the Caribbean, though, we have, by and large, we have Indian, as in Indians from India, and African people who control this a tremendous amount of territory in Amerindian space. And so, and while we have, and one of the things, one of my thought is that African states or Indian states, like for example Trinidad and Guyana, which have been established on Native Amerindian property, these states should be vicariously liable for the genocide of Amerindian people. Right? And so lastly, I just want to say, with regards to the movement for reparations for African slavery and indigenous genocide, I think it is a significant error for these two claims to be merged together, because while we experience genocide and we have lost all our properties in the region, and I do not like to call it the Caribbean region, because the Caribbean means the area, Carib means the meat-eating people, the legitimate genocide by calling us meat-eating people, right? I do not like to call it the Caribbean. But I will say that the error in pursuing a claim together with African slavery is that on the birth of independence in the Caribbean, African people, by and large, were gifted tremendous, the real estate of Amerindian people. While Amerindian people remain on the peripheries, Amerindian people remain on the peripheries, and these new emerging African states, especially Barbados, because I studied in Barbados, there is no proper inherent recognitions of indigenous people in the state. Plus, the states in these areas feels like they have no responsibility to help us repair our institutions, like our Kalinago Chief and Council, which is one of the weakest institutions because while, for example, the international instrument says that the state must finance our local governing administrative structure, the Kalinago Chief and Council is more in name, because it comes under the legislation that governs other local councils in Dominica. So it's not even the autonomy. We're not exercising that autonomy and self-determination which the law, which the international instrument says must govern indigenous people's rights. So there are range of issues of which I am concerned about, right? And so, but a lot of my issues are concerned directly. What is the responsibility of the modern Caribbean state, indigenous peoples? That is one of the questions. And oftentimes, if I, for example, were to go to Dominica or Barbados or Trinidad, and I would speak like that, I would sound like a radical, you know, and I am only being logical. So these are some of my concerns, and hopefully, at some point in time, I know let me say greetings to Miss Nelsia and Chief Ricardo Hernandez, because as a 16-year-old, when I went to Trinidad to attend the Organization of Caribbean Peoples Conference, I was taken aback by all of that information in that conference. I am much older now, but I think there should also be a conference for young indigenous people to be edified on indigenous peoples, other indigenous communities in the Caribbean, and indigenous people's rights. And I speak like that today because back when I was a 16-year-old, I was privileged enough to attend that conference in Trinidad. So I hope, Nelsie, if you can hear me, please give my regards to Chief Hernandez. And I do have a lot to say, but I will not say too much, because I was only given a limited time to speak, and I think I have abused that privilege. Thank you very much.